very likely to continue to look very much like a webinar. So the distinction between the two is somewhat thin. Later, I think Gurnita and Toby Kretschmer will give us a very quick overview to the end about the plans for the annual conference, because they are chairing it this year. We have the webinar series, which is of course part of what we're doing today. We have teaching resources, which range all the way from teaching materials to being able to find guest speakers, if you like, for a class session or something. We've had a very successful podcast series on making remote work, which is led by Yulia Estrada, who's also here on the call today. And we're about to transition to a new series on organizational resilience, which is going to be kicked off soon by Ranjay Gulati, then Connie Helfat, Rashi Agarwal, and Dan Levitin. So all in all, and of course, we have a certification program along with the European Organizational Design Forum and the Organizational Design Forum. So an interesting slew of activities, and if you're not already a member, I strongly urge you to consider becoming one. It's a fun crowd. What more can I say? All right, so today our plan is to essentially meet to celebrate a very important historic moment, and the moment is the 20th anniversary of this book. And I recall seeing this book as a doctoral student. I was in the PhD program at that time. And it had, as I suspect it did for many of our panelists today, a very important impact in thinking of the relationship between technology and organization. And for many of us at that time, I think the struggle was to find a golden mean between the more crude forms of technological determinism versus the complete social constructivist view where, you know, organizations and technology kind of float independent of each other with very little to connect them. And Carliss's work arrived as kind of a lifesaver, which showed us a very rigorous way of making that connection without necessarily tipping over into one or the other direction. But it's a great honor and pleasure to use this ODC webinar to celebrate the 20th anniversary of this wonderful book. And also, I think, to give a sneak preview of Design Rules Volume 2, which should be coming up soon. And Carliss has kindly agreed to say a few words about that towards the end of this session. We have an absolutely stellar panel of speakers to talk about the influence that this work has had on their research, to outline some thoughts about what else needs to be done, where else the field might take these questions. And without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. I haven't been very creative in sequencing this. I think we'll go alphabetically. That's okay. So if that's all fine, then Stefano, over to you. You have about 5 to 7 minutes. Then it'll be Michael, followed by Rahul, then Samina, and then Melissa. Stefano, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. So yes, the alphabetical order, okay, I'll adjust to it as I go along. First of all, thank you so much, Phanish and colleagues, to organize this wonderful event. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here to celebrate Carliss and her fundamental contribution to our field. I think I also came across the book when I was a PhD student, also trying to find my way in the whole, maelstrom of different approaches that were trying to look at the interplay between technology and organization, going from the totally sociological, ethnographic, socially constructivist approach to the more naive determinism. And indeed, as Phanish said, the Design Rules was a lifesaver in many ways. I think it was, to me, a very powerful, very transparent, and extremely parsimonious, if you think of it analytically, I mean, a way of representing the relationship between technology and organizations in a way which did justice to, first of all, the role of technology in shaping decisions, in shaping behaviors at very different levels of analysis, without falling in any form of naive determinism, but actually giving strength and voice to technologies in ways that back in the day, I think were not fully represented in the community. It was a powerful way to see the connections to organization design and to strategy overall. It's a kind of logic that is pervasive throughout the book, and that is still used nowadays in what I do, and it still works fantastically well, by the way, when I teach to our students here, and they're all engineers, and they come to our classes convinced that technology rules, and in many ways that is true, but in ways that are more nuanced and sophisticated than they probably see. And I think the logic and the theory and the approach to theorizing that Carliss has developed over the years is still, to me, a very clear, very inspiring way to look at these issues and to engage others in those. I think there are two issues that I think this line of thinking, and I really look forward to hear about the new book, are still really inspiring work. Let me try to highlight two connections to ongoing work, basically in two very different streams, if you like. One is, I think, the discussion about platforms and ecosystems. And I think that in many ways, the current discussion about platforms and what that means in terms of industrial organization could really benefit from going back to the foundations that Carliss and Kim Clark laid down 20 years ago, to provide order, to provide parsimoniousness, to provide clarity in many of the concepts that are used, because they build on that discussion. They build on design rules. Sometimes it's done explicitly, sometimes not so explicitly. And I think it will be important to bring back some of that clarity in this explosion of research, which is super interesting, very cool, and is kind of diversifying already in many different directions. And sometimes it is difficult, at least for me, to identify a clear core. And again, the distinction between core and periphery is important in the platform discussion, I think. The second line of work that I think is happening today, and I think it grew quite detached from the line of work within which design rules was developed, is a discussion about microfoundations. And at some broad level, microfoundations is usually kind of likened to a discussion about finding plausible cognitive or psychological underpinnings to decisions. And clearly that is very important, by all means. At the same time, this discussion has gone a long way to doing justice to the fact that the psychological or cognitive foundations of our decisions also have to do with the environment we interact in. And in this environment, technology plays still a fundamental role. The technologies we use to take decisions, the object we manipulate to exchange information. I think design rules was a wonderful example of actually how the physical interface that we have to navigate, to interact in teams, in groups, within organizations, are actually a very fundamental part of our agency, of the way we shape decisions, of the way we communicate decisions. I think the current discussion about microfoundation, which is again super exciting and very cool, has gone a few steps away from that beginning. Sometimes for very good reasons. And I think it could be actually useful to reconnect that to the work of Carliss on design rules. So on this, Carliss, again, thank you so much. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here. And there is simply no way I can convey how much I've learned from you over the past 20 years.
Stefano, I thank you so much. And the learning goes in both directions for you and for everyone speaking, and many of you who are attending. So I just want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Carliss. Michael, over to you, man.
Indeed. Well, showing my vintage, I too was a young PhD student, and I had actually started looking.
I will point out I was younger, though. Okay.
Was that?
I was going to point out I was younger, though.
You were a younger PhD student, which is why you're speaking about the book. And that's the interesting twist in the story. When you hadn't yet entered the PhD program, Carliss would visit, and I still recall with excitement the different paper copies that would be left in the seminar rooms of Steinberg Dietrich Hall with the previews of the book that came as chapters that Carliss was circulating. And she was thankfully quite popular at Wharton at the time. For a good reason, and we were given snippets, previews of what ultimately became the book. So we knew the chapters, and we were waiting for the magnum opus to emerge. But even before the magnum opus emerged and it all gelled together, it was really something that was very exciting, because it was an interesting complement to what was happening in the late 90s. And I admit that the kind of excitement that I felt reading works of Herb Simon, in the sense of being clever, original, and a way to reframe things that were familiar, was what I also felt reading Carliss. And because it was able to bridge questions of technology and questions of organization. So it was great to see Design Rules version 1 all together. And I'm now excited to see Design Rules 2. But speaking about the things that I think made me excited then and continue to mark the importance of this book, I thought about a few things that I thought are particularly noteworthy. The first one is what I call the research partial derivative problem. The issue was certainly then, and I fear even more so in some ways now, most of the stuff that we would see in the intersection of organization and management were efforts to try to use one particular theoretical lens to explain the world, hence the sense of the partial derivative. And what I liked about Carliss is that the way that she would look at it is not say that I have already come with my theory that will explain stuff, but she would provide an overview of an area and try to say, what is it that could explain it? What is it that can explain a broader expanse that may be happening? And that relates to two more principles. The first, the kaleidoscope principle, and the second, the chunky question principle. Kaleidoscope principle, because once you have read it, once you've figured out the point that Carliss is making, you're able to revisit stuff that you already knew, but in a way that gives them shape that they didn't have before. So reading the book, reading the different chapters of the book and the way that they come together allows you to have a sense of some irregularities that are evident once you put them together, but were not evident ex ante. And the chunky question challenge is that it is something that looks at interesting and big chunky questions in terms of how is it that we organize stuff, and that addresses things like the evolution of the computer sector. And what I found absolutely fascinating was this question of how do we organize stuff and why? And I'd say that other than Sid Winter, she was the person with greatest intellectual influence even before I did my PhD. And I fondly recall the detailed notes, usually in red pen, sometimes blue, that you would get in the manuscripts mailed in a crimson envelope with generosity that I think is very hard to parallel, certainly not in terms of the depth of insight and comments. And Carliss, I have kept a number of your detailed comments to my early scribbles, whether they were published or not. And, you know, I'm certainly very grateful for all of them that happened consistently. I think that what I keep from Carliss's work is that the idea of boundaries, an idea that I've been fascinated with, are not a primer, but a result. And I think that this is a really interestingly different way of looking at it. Because if you think about all the Williamsonese going on at the time, the question is, given boundaries, how do people decide where they position themselves or whether they unify them? And the question that Carliss's research brought about was, why do we have boundaries to begin with? What are the different things that stick together in boundaries? And I think that this is something that morphed, and after the book was done, morphed into the ICC that Carliss wrote on where boundaries come from, that I think takes things that perhaps could be well under the radar screen, but is able to reframe them in an important theoretical way. So I think that it also gives you, or at least gave me, a sense of trying to peel the onion a little bit more and not stop having identified something that works, like, you know, importing the idea of option value in terms of the different modules and how these compared to another structural alternative would be better or inferior. That was a tool, but that was not quite it. And I think that that's, to me, that was an exciting bit. Now, if I am to look ahead, And I think that there's been certainly a lot of impact of Carliss's work, and certainly in everything that I've done, whether we look at the reason for which markets emerge in the first place, that relates to the idea of the same forces that create modular or more non-modular structures that are primitives to the existence of markets, to the co-evolution of the things that bind stuff together and the boundaries that you have, to the broader concept of industry architectures and later work in terms of ecosystems and the way that they go. You can see her influence being important there, as much as it is also in organizational design. Now, I'm not going to speak about organizational design because there's a lot of people who will. Let me just say that in terms of the way that the economy is organized, I think that the work that Carliss has initiated, both with Design Rules 1 and with what I see from Design Rules 2, is becoming even more relevant, primarily because history is starting to be less important than it was. What do I mean? I mean that a number of structures that exist in sectors were the result of path dependencies that had created ways of organizing labor. We're starting to do two things. First, regulators are becoming more adventurous. Second, technology provides us with the possibility of reorganizing things more drastically. And we see this tension in areas like healthcare, where we're like, we wouldn't be here if we started designing it today. We need to rethink how we design it. Now, this, to me, is an interesting validation, an opportunity to reconsider what Carliss has offered. Because we see these latent opportunities which need to be combined with a better understanding of how stuff can be put together in order to be more effective. And also raises the question, more effective, more efficient, for whom? Or who stands to benefit? So the question of effectiveness and the cui bono question, which now that we're thinking about regulating these big platforms and ecosystems and saying, how do we organize things, not only in order for them to be functional, but for them also to provide a level playing field, I think is an area that will be able to leverage the work that we have. And I think that as society, we have a number of questions to ask, as we're like, what should we encourage or not? What are the principles that we should get as we confront these new technologically enabled opportunities that are supported by information technology? And similarly, how do we do that in a way that is not going to be leading people astray? Only half jokingly in the paper that we looked at in terms of the auto manufacturing sector, we saw with John-Paul McDuffie and Gente instances where the auto people were just probably badly understanding part of the headlines of what was modular and what was not, what was in their interest and what wasn't. And I think that, to me, this interesting case where Carliss herself gave us some of the potential warning signals of overusing or overly simplistically using part of the lessons from the design rules suggests that there is yet scope to start thinking more carefully about what are the strategic implications. So strategic implications, societal implications in a world which is much more reconfigurable than before. I think it's a terrific place to both applaud the work that Carliss has started and think about what the next generation implications of that are going to be. So Carliss, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That's terrific. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. I know you are on a tight schedule, so thank you so much for being here. Truly appreciate it, and have benefited so much from our various associations over the years. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Rahul, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Phanish. And it's, I have a much more recent vintage than Stefano and Michael. So even more of a great honor for me to be a part of this panel. And we were talking about the textbooks and doctoral students earlier on as we were warming up. And I remember as a doctoral student at INSEAD 2005 or so, there were only 2 books I legitimately bought on a very tight research budget. One was Nate Rosenberg, Inside the Black Box, A View of Technology. And the second one was Baldwin and Clark, Design Rules 1. And I think to me, and I was one of the Stefano students who came from a very technical, deterministic engineering view of technology. And as I was reading a lot of the literature I was feeling a little underwhelmed in terms of how technology as an object of inquiry has been treated. And I think both an economic historian view that Nate Rosenberg brought in terms of evolutionary processes and technology interdependencies, and then Baldwin and Clark in terms of really, in my view, opening the black box for me and making me see there's aspects of technology architectures, their task, and then their transfers in a sort of a production environment. And so to me, those really gave me tools and insights to really use technology as an object of intellectual inquiry in a very systematic, logical manner. And so what I've